that's as good as it gets. Just to know that our product is bringing enjoyment to people's lives, and of course, we hope that's responsibly enjoyed. But when you know you're making people happy, that's a pretty cool thing.
Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Work Podcast. I am your host, Dan Krikorian. I am a songwriter, college basketball coach, and professor from Southern California. Each episode here, we feature a special guest from all walks of life, and we ask them to explore the triumphs, challenges, and the twists and turns that they have taken in their chosen fields. Writers, musicians, coaches, athletes, business owners, and everything in between, we peel back the curtain to hear their stories, to walk their paths, to find out how they breathe life into their beautiful work. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast. We are in the middle of a special edition of the podcast called Whiskey Week. And so if you're joining us for that, welcome. And we're excited about the show. Today's guest is the great Chris Morris from Woodford Reserve, the Master Distiller. And we're so lucky to get him on the podcast to share all about his life and story and all that goes into making Woodford Reserve. Before we get to Chris, a couple of things about the podcast. If you could, on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you happen to be listening, like, rate, comment about the podcast, hopefully positively, but share it and pass it along to those that you think might also be interested. That helps people find it that are interested in the same type of show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which is the best way to stay up to date on things going on with the podcast, as well as with my music. I'm also a musician and released my 5th record a few months back earlier in this year, and you can find all that information on dankrikorian.com or beautifulworkpodcast.com. They take you to the same spot. You can check out all that's going on with the podcast, with music, and hope you sign up to stay in tune on what's going on. Well, that's it for this week. Really excited to bring you Chris's story. So without further ado, let's get to the show. Chris Morris is the master distiller at the award-winning whiskey producing company, Woodford Reserve. Woodford Reserve is a brand that is part of the Brown-Forman Corporation, which is one of the largest American-owned companies in the spirit and wine business. Based in Louisville, Kentucky, Brown-Forman also manufactures brands such as Jack Daniel's, Early Times, Old Forester, Canadian Mist, and Korbel, to name a few. Chris began his career in bourbon in 1976 as a trainee in Brown-Forman's Central Lab. In 1997, he found himself as the understudy to the famous Lincoln Henderson, who was Woodford Reserve's inaugural master distiller. In 2003, Chris succeeded Lincoln. In the years that followed, he was responsible for creating the world's first bourbon finished in Chardonnay and Pinot Noir barrels, and is also credited with developing the world's first maple barrel. As head master distiller at one of the world's fastest growing bourbon companies, he spends his days innovating and planning future releases. He's the mastermind behind Woodford Reserve Double Oaked, Rye, and the Masters Collection. Chris is here today to talk about his story, growing up in the whiskey industry, why it's so important to be a lifelong learner and historian of your craft, and why he believes so much in innovation. Okay, I am joined now by Chris Morris, Master Distiller for Woodford Reserve. Chris, thank you very much for joining the podcast this morning. We have battled some technical difficulties, but I'm excited to have you on.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Okay, Chris, we're going to get into a ton of stuff about bourbon and whiskey and all that you've done in your career. But is there anything outside of whiskey and bourbon that any hobbies or interests that you have that perhaps people don't really know about?
Oh, I sure do. One, this is the perfect time of year. I love to garden, and that's not vegetable gardening. That's flowers and ornamental plants. Have some nice property, so I'd love to do that. And also, I'm an amateur sculptor, so I like to be in my studio at home sculpting as well.
I had heard that from someone else that was on this podcast for this Whiskey Week. Carla Carlton said that to maybe ask you about that.
Yes, Carla so nicely did a story about it several years ago for our college magazine. I don't know where Carla went to school, but she is the communications director for Bellarmine University.
Yes.
And that was very kind of her.
Now, how did you get into that?
Well, when I went to university to study business, while I was working at Brown-Forman in the old Forester Distillery, I also started taking some art classes because my mother was an artist for Brown-Forman, our parent company, and she did advertising back in the 50s and 60s. And so I grew up in a household full of art, and I took some art courses and just happened to get hooked on sculpting.
Any plans to sell or make a business out of any of it, or is it just sort of something you do for yourself?
Well, I do it mainly for myself, and I did sell pieces early on.
Great.
But in the past number of years, I've been donating sculptures to charitable auctions and or just giving them away or putting them out in the garden for myself to enjoy.
That's great. Well, a bigger event that you guys just had, I know you and I were talking before we started recording, was the Kentucky Derby. As we're taping this episode, just finished this past weekend. Outside of the controversial finish and whatnot that surrounded the ordering, how was the Derby for you, and are you recovered yet from all the activities?
The Derby was great, Dan. Woodford Reserve was celebrating our 20th year of being the first and only official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby. So that puts me on 20 straight derbies promoting Woodford Reserve. And of course, our second year as the presenting sponsor, which is just fabulous. So we were very busy making local and national television and print and video and internet appearances, myself and Assistant Master Distiller Elizabeth McCall. So those were some very long days, a very long week, and we got through the rain okay. So it was a fabulous derby, and I don't know if you can ever recover from a derby.
Now, you mentioned are partnered with the Kentucky Derby, and you guys always have the $1,000 mint julep, in which is made with Woodford Reserve. So was there anything particularly special about this year or this year's edition of that mint julep that you guys did?
Well, yes, each year of the $1,000 mint julep program, and this is the 14th year, has been different from the cup, the number of cups, the mint julep itself, and the charity that the proceeds go to. And that's the key, is we are raising money for good causes through the sale of the $1,000 mint julep. And this year, we had a unique charity. It was the John Asher Memorial Scholarship Fund. John Asher was, for 30 years, the voice and the face of Churchill Downs, and he passed away unexpectedly last summer. So we want to keep his memory alive with this scholarship fund at his alma mater, Western Kentucky University. We had 145 cups. This was Derby 145. We've never had this many cups, and we haven't always tied our number into the Derby number, but this year we did. The cups themselves, as I mentioned earlier, Dan, were unique, a new design, have the twin spires and a little barrel on them. because the ingredients were special. We have been calling the mint julep ingredients the best of Kentucky. And of course, the Derby Day is the best day in Kentucky. So the best of Kentucky on the best day in Kentucky. And that means all of our ingredients have to be local. This year, we got some Woodford County honey from Hosey's Honey, diluted it with water, made a honey syrup, and aged that honey syrup in a little bourbon barrel, a 3-gallon barrel, up in the Twin Spires for 145 days. And of course, it took on vanilla and caramel and some spice notes. It became a very, very good honey simple syrup. And we used mint grown for us at Churchill Downs, Kentucky Kernel Mint. We made our ice from spring water from the Woodford Reserve Distillery, and of course, Woodford Reserve. So it was a very special julep as well.
Wow. Well, it sounds delicious the way you just described it, and I'm glad that it went so well. I was going to tell you before we started, whenever I do an interview with someone, I usually do a fair amount of preparation to try to, whatever it is, an author or musician, whatever it is, to dive into what they do. And I've really enjoyed diving into all that Woodford Reserve, all that you make, specifically the double oaked Woodford Reserve. I've been enjoying sipping that as I prepared, not this morning, but in recent weeks preparing. So you do a great job of describing the process. And so had to say that there. Well, I'm glad that the mint julep was such a success. And as you're talking, and I noticed this, in a lot of your interviews and throughout the course of your careers, you're such a great historian of bourbon and whiskey in Kentucky and in the world. And when did that start for you, as far as you understood, the gravity and the importance of the history of bourbon and whiskey?
Well, again, growing up in a bourbon household with my mother and father both having been or were Brown-Forman employees, I didn't realize how important books are. I realize now, but as a child I didn't. And I grew up in a household full of books. And a number of these books were about bourbon. Bluegrass Bourbon Bells, I think, is a name from Harrison Kroll. Calgary, not Calgary, that's Chuck. Calgary, the social history of bourbon from Carson. So I would look at these books, mainly looking at the photographs because I was very young, and just started soaking in bourbon history and old stories. And as I got older, of course, I started reading and started researching on my own. And as we would drive through the countryside, seeing long abandoned distilleries, overgrown with vines and trees, it was sort of like looking at the Mayan ruins in Central America. I just thought that was so cool. And I guess that's where my interest in the history of our industry began.
And it's obviously really helped you because you understand where it began and then where it's going. And you at Woodford Reserve have always been on the cutting edge of newer, innovative bourbons and whiskeys. And it's interesting because a bigger organization like Brown-Forman and Woodford generally are slower to change, but you yourself have embodied innovation. And why is that?
Well, that's something, again, I think my background brought forward is an interest once I was exposed to the Scotch industry and the tequila industry and started learning about the other spirit types and spending time in Mexico and Scotland and Ireland over the years. I started questioning, why do we do this? It's sort of like the small child asking the adult, why is the sky blue? Mm-hmm. And the answer is because.
All right.
And that's what I would hear, because. That's the way it's always been done. That's the rules. So that sort of made me want to explore the whys and the hows and the why nots. And that has led to this innovative spirit, is just the curiosity of about our industry and about the history that backed it up. And I think that's what we do so well at Woodford, is we bring history, heritage, and modern innovation together.
Sure, absolutely. Maybe let's take one step backwards. And for those that are listening to this podcast that are either new to bourbon or don't really have as much of an idea about how the industry works, for them, and even for myself, what exactly would you say a master distiller's job description is?
Well, every company has its own description or criteria, since none exists at a governmental level, just
Right.
like small batch is not defined and therefore has no meaning except to those who use it. At Brown-Forman, the master distiller is responsible for the quality of the product. We do not necessarily run a distillery. In fact, we found out many years ago that probably was not the best idea, because if you're in charge of running the distillery, the chance may occur that you have to cut corners for some arbitrary reason in terms of quality. And that's the old analogy of the fox guarding the hen house. So we're an independent person within the company who will fight for the quality of the product, fight for the processes, and fight's a strong word, because at Brown-Forman, we're a very collegial, collaborative company, and but we have to stand up for what's right. So I'm responsible for quality. I'm responsible for innovation, as you pointed out, and those are the key components of my job.
Okay. So what does a typical day look like in your world?
Well, we'll have 3 primary days a week scheduled for batching, for putting together batches of Woodford Reserve or double oaked or Woodford Reserve rye. And those may float. In other words, days could be added, but they're usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Tuesdays and Thursdays are days for meetings and for things such as being in the laboratory for studying innovation. And also, as master distiller, I get to do fun things like speak to you.
Thank you.
And host guests at the distillery. Last week, of course, Derby Week, we had 7 journalists visit us over the course of the week. We had 10 local journalists join us at Churchill Downs on Wednesday in the Brown-Forman suite. So that's a fun part of the job as well. And then very important is developing the next generation. I'm the 7th master distiller at Brown-Forman, the 2nd at Woodford Reserve, and part of my very important responsibility is to develop number 8 and or number 3, and that is Elizabeth McCall.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly into a next question that I had in that succession planning in the bourbon industry. And so what was it about Elizabeth that has stuck out to you as someone that's able to eventually down the line take over Woodford in the way that you have?
Well, Elizabeth, of course, has been with us for a number of years, and she got her start, like I did, in the R&D department. Back in my day, it was called the lab. Now it's called R&D, which is a more appropriate term, I'm sure. And she came through a training program that I was conducting about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was impressed with her go-to-itness, her passion, and that's what's very important. People can be very smart. They can have different experiences, but unless you're passionate about what you're doing and ready to work hard and sacrifice time for the greater good, that's not going to get you very far. And she had those attributes, and I saw that. And also, she has a great personality. I saw how over the years how people respond to her, and I think that's important. If you're going to be a leader, I think it's better to attract more flies with honey than otherwise. So
right,
she had the right personality, but she had the responsibility as a sensory science of studying our quality, and I thought that was a good background.
What about yourself? What are the traits or characteristics that you think have allowed you to sustain success and excellence over a number of years in your career?
I believe there are some of the very things we just spoke about. Passionate, you have to be passionate about the industry, your particular company and brand, of course. I'm also very passionate not just about the industry, but the history of our industry, which means you'll fight for them. You'll fight for what's right. And you have to be a hard worker. And I also believe it's not about me. You cannot be focused on you. You have to be focused on the brand and your job. So if you want to get in this business because you think it's going to be a load of fun and you're going to be famous and travel and all this kind of stuff, I think you have the wrong attitude. You have to work for the company and the brand.
And you obviously have embodied those in your career. And one thing I've noticed is your willingness to talk to folks like myself, to talk to the media, to sit down and do interviews, and sort of always be an ambassador for Woodford, but also for bourbon and whiskey on the whole. What is that about you that you're so good at that? Because not everybody is.
Well, again, thank you. I think it is that putting the industry and your brand above self. And when you speak for the industry, it's a collective betterment for everyone. So you can't be negative about other brands or other companies, because that doesn't get you anywhere. And therefore, I've been proud to have served through Discus, now the Distilled Spirits Institute. I've been a representative for the industry and Brown-Forman at the Kentucky Distillers Association, and some other international organizations such as the International Spirits Competition and the International Wine and Spirits Competition, being maybe the only bourbon distiller on the taste panels among all the other great master blenders and distillers from around the world. So you can't take that responsibility lightly, and I do enjoy doing that.
That's great. Well, bourbon is in, as you very well know, there's a boom right now for sure in the United States, and I know it's expanding worldwide. And the demand for bourbon is very high. And I know, though, for you, you've been in it for a very long time. Can you remember and describe what it was like in the earlier days when it wasn't at the point it is now, and potentially how it transformed into where it is at this point?
Well, I sure do remember, because I joined the industry right at its peak. And the old timers telling me, oh, it always grows every year. It will grow 2-3%, because the industry was focused primarily in the United States and a few export markets. And of course, that didn't happen after that point. My first year, it declined and continued to decline. And then when you see distilleries closing and brands going away, brands that you grew up with and you thought they were indestructible, and you see them fading away quickly, that's very sobering. And of course, it was not good for our community, not good for Kentucky. And we thought it was going to go away. Some people were saying bourbon will go the way of the dinosaurs. It will become extinct. So that's where the launch of a brand like Woodford Reserve 23 years ago was so important, when brands are going out of existence, to launch a new brand and to open or reopen an old distillery, and a distillery that had a visitor center, which was very unusual at the time. And when people thought that was crazy, and even back then, I don't think we had the awareness of how important that was, because we were just fighting every day, fighting for existence, fighting for acceptance, fighting for recognition from the trade. And it just shows you how a dedicated vision and lots of hard work can pay off if you're willing to go the distance.
Do you remember a specific time or year where you could feel the tides changing in the industry, and maybe any events that particularly happened, or was it a very slow process?
Well, it's been a relatively slow process until recently. And I remember when craft and micro distilleries were visiting Woodford Reserve and having their early meetings. We didn't even think about the significance of that. Woodford Reserve was a mecca for craft distillers. I remember having to order 30 or 40 box lunches and like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. That many people. Now look at how big that movement has become.
Right.
But I quite honestly to this day I still think or feel that our mission is not accomplished. Even though people talk about the bourbon boom, I don't think it's good enough. We need to keep going. And it hasn't sunk in, I guess, or never will sink in, and I don't want it to, that things are going to get easy. No, you never give up. And one of the funny things is we were wondering 20 plus years ago, will we ever make it? Will we ever make it? We worked really hard. And now that we've quote unquote made it, we're working even harder.
We now welcome back to the show our featured bartender from the Bluegrass Lounge in Arvada, Colorado, Josh Schwartz.
Hey Dan, thanks for having me back for Whiskey Week. Today I'll be talking about two of my establishment's most beloved cocktails. Even though bourbon and American whiskey is experiencing yet another renaissance, a large market of people are still hesitant of whiskey's strong, bold character. So cocktails can be a nice stepping stool for customers' palate, and as I say, to get you to start drinking it neat. At the Bluegrass Coffee and Bourbon Lounge in Old Town Arvada, Colorado, we get both whiskey aficionados and customers who insist they'll never drink the brown liquor. They can both agree that the Blue Jeans and Moonbeams in Kentucky coffee are delicious classics. You can't go wrong with an old-fashioned, but you might never want to leave after trying a blood orange old-fashioned. The Blue Jeans is just that, a refreshing, simple cocktail that takes no time to make. It all starts with a rocks glass full of ice. Some people like sugar cubes. I'm a fan of simple syrup, which is 1 part sugar, 1 part water, boiled down and cooled. You'll only need a dash. I mix an assortment of orange bitters together to make my own batch, but play around with it and see what you enjoy. I add 5 full, strong dashes of the orange bitters into the glass, followed by the most important ingredient, Basil Hayden bourbon. We use 2 ounces of Basil Hayden for its soft, sweet notes, which allows the citrusness to flow through. Next is a 1/2 ounce of Salerno blood orange liqueur and just a 1/4 ounce of Carpano Antica sweet vermouth. Make sure to stir the cocktail well and finish the drink by zesting with an orange rind. And there you have it, the Blue Jeans and Moonbeams, one of the Bluegrass Lounge's most popular cocktails. The next is proclaimed as the world's greatest alcoholic coffee drink, the Kentucky Coffee. In 2017, the Bluegrass Lounge was awarded Best Coffee Shop in all of Denver, and I have a feeling that the Kentucky Coffee might have helped. At our shop, we have a state-of-the-art espresso machine from Italy with high-pressured steamers. But feel free to substitute the espresso with a larger portion of coffee and heating your milk another method. Generally, I start the process by grinding, tampering, and pulling the 2-ounce double espresso shot. While I'm waiting for the shot to pull through, I get a coffee mug and add the fun stuff. 1 ounce of your choice of bourbon, 3/4 ounce of Kahlua, and 1 ounce of bourbon cream. Most people are familiar with Bailey's, but you can find Buffalo Trace or Ezra Brooks bourbon cream at most large liquor stores. It's made with all real products, so make sure to refrigerate. After the espresso is finished pulling, I add the double shot and quickly steam 2 ounces of whole milk to 160 degrees. As you can, another method of heating. After that, just add the steamed milk and stir the drink very well. Add some whipped cream for fun, and there's the Kentucky Coffee, folks, which is always a nice nightcapper after a few Blue Jeans and Moonbeams. I hope this will all lead you on to your own bartending conquest and see what fun cocktails you can whip up with American whiskey. Or you can come visit me at the Bluegrass Coffee and Bourbon Lounge in the heart of historic Old Town Arvada, Colorado, where you can enjoy award-winning fare, nightly live music, and a beautiful outdoor patio. I want to thank you, Dan, for having me on this awesome segment and putting together this wonderful Whiskey Week. Thanks.
One of the things I've read about that, distilleries and whatnot are doing a great job of now is making Kentucky a place that you must go see. You must go see the distilleries and having it more of a tourism attraction, building restaurants and making that whole experience better for the consumer. And so it's not just the bottle on the shelf anymore. It extends far beyond that.
It certainly has become more than the bottle on the shelf, as you note, Dan, with bourbon festivals, not the Kentucky Bourbon Festival alone, the Kentucky Bourbon Affair, rock concerts, music events, hotels being built, multi-million-dollar hotels being built with bourbon themes, bourbon markets, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, obviously, the Fraser History Museum having a wonderful, comprehensive bourbon experience. It's incredible. So it has become very much an experience for people. And Kentucky should be the place for American whiskey aficionados or foreign whiskey aficionados as a must visit, just like you must visit Scotland or Ireland to see those iconic whiskeys in their home places. So I think it's going to continue certainly to grow, but the product is the backing of all that. So the product certainly has to grow as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned a couple of other places internationally. There's this bourbon boom right now in the U.S., but looking down the line, do you foresee other markets internationally where bourbon can move into and have the same type of growth that it is right now in the U.S.?
Oh, yes. We are certainly trying to expand our distribution footprint in Western Europe, in parts of Asia, Middle East. We again, that long vision calls for bourbon to be an international spirit, just like Scotch whiskey is. But again, Scotch whiskey has a long lead on us because it was built in the old British Empire and Commonwealth days. So it can't be done overnight, but you have to take the first step, certainly.
Sure. At this point in your career, you have as I know, a master palate, and you've tasted so many whiskeys and bourbons and whatnot in your lifetime. Have you recently, in the past couple of years, tasted a new bourbon or new whiskey that's really just blown you away?
To be honest, nothing that's absolutely blown me away. We've been very fortunate that Brown-Forman has acquired some great single malt, so it was fun to get back into the single malt business with Glendronach and Ben Riach, and just to again rediscover the depth and breadth of Scotch whiskey character. Of course, we've just built in partnership with the Cunningham family, the Slane Distillery in Ireland, and that was fun to be involved in that process. So I think the best way is just to try and appreciate all the different styles of whiskey across the world, and just recognize that they're all just different, and one's not better than the other. They're just different. It's good to understand how and why they're different.
What do you see that your role is in the bourbon whiskey industry as a whole?
Oh, my role, I think, is to provide guidance through my experience with the Kentucky Distillers Association, specifically. Campbell Brown is our board member there, and I'm involved in some committees to work with the Louisville Bourbon District, the Bourbon and Local Food Work Group here in Louisville, just again to share my experience with these other groups as we try to do, as we talked about earlier, expand the experience and scope of bourbon, not only across the country but across the world.
Absolutely. The economics of bourbon. I know part of your job is, looking forward at distribution and down the line, and the beautiful thing, but the difficult thing about bourbon is that it needs to age at least 4 years. How do you, and obviously you're not giving away any of your internal thoughts and with the company, but the supply and demand of trying to look forward in the future with the amount of barrels and distribution you'll need as opposed to what you have at the time. How difficult is that, and what's the process that you guys use to try to use that foresight?
Well, it's an exacting process for us, and it's I don't think it's a gamble if you have confidence in your brands and your brand building ability and your distribution network, which we of course do. But when you have a product, as you note, that requires a number of years, and we have barrels of Woodford Reserve in the warehouse right now that are approaching 14 years of age. So we've got an inventory that ranges from barrels we're filling today to 14 years old, and every possible year in between. So that inventory outlook goes out more than a decade. So every 6 months we update it. We look at how sales trends are going on a global basis, and we get that information from our local sales and marketing teams, whether they're in Germany or in Brazil or in Japan, of course here in the United States. And they know more than we do, of course, what's going on in the local market. And we'll roll the numbers up, and we will adjust our production schedule accordingly, make more, make less, and then 6 months later we adjust it again. So when you have 10 plus year inventory, 6 month adjustments, that's pretty quick. So we are very much on top of our inventory and demand schedule.
At what point do you know that a bourbon or a whiskey is done and ready? For you personally, is it just, an internal thing, taste wise, this is it? Or how do you know when to say, okay, hey, it needs another 6 months or another year, or now it's ready?
Well, of course, it comes down to taste.
Yep.
And intuition, experience also come into play. But sometimes when you're creating a new whiskey, such as a master's collection or distillery series, and it's unique, not just a new whiskey, but a unique whiskey, you have to make that decision. It's good now. Will it be better in a year? Will it be better in 2 years? Maybe, maybe not, but it's good now. And you just have to say, here it goes. So it's, again, based on my personal palate. And now I have Elizabeth to help out. We'll make a decision, we'll agree, and off we go.
Do you enjoy that process?
I do. As I've been teaching her, it is a responsibility. What happens if no one else likes it? What happens if no one buys this product? What happens if it gets a poor review? It can be very stressful. So you have to have courage. You have to have confidence in your ability and in your decision making, and go for it. And once it's done, don't look back. Keep on going with the next project.
For you, how do you continue to learn or feed your brain? Are you a book reader, podcasts, anything that you do on the regular basis?
Yes, I'm an avid reader. I don't go much into the electronic entertainment, so I'm not podcasts, televisions, or anything like that. We don't even have a television in the home. No cable.
Really?
Shocks people. So I read, and I go to the library weekly and just grab books of all different subjects and read and learn and experience. So that's what I do.
any particular that stick out that have been more impactful on your life and your career, book-wise?
Well, certainly, as a history buff, reading the true histories of the sacrifice that our men and women have made in world wars and the Civil War, Revolutionary War, etc., always just strikes me. When I talk about being courageous and releasing a new product, the courage they have shown, it just belittles our attempts at saying we're courageous. So that certainly has an impact on me, growing up in a household who all the uncles and my father served in the Second World War. One lost his life. That really that still impacts me.
Sure. What's one of the best investments that you've made in your career?
Ooh, that's a good question. Investments. Ooh. Well, certainly going to college, getting advanced degrees. I have 2 advanced degrees. You can never say that's a bad investment. But I guess the best investment was to learn about our industry, to study, to be at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night with a bottle of some whiskey or other and studying it and writing notes about it and writing flavor descriptors, that constant self-education. So education, I think, is, whichever way you look at it, is an investment that cannot go wrong.
Absolutely. That's great. And that's obviously served you very well in your career. What brings you, of all the things that you do as a master distiller and an ambassador for bourbon and the brands, what brings you the most joy in your career?
Well, today, I can't speak for the past because I can't remember the past anymore. It's to see people enjoying our product and in the excitement when someone says, I'm a Woodford Reserve drinker, I love Woodford Reserve or double oaked, and to be out at events or package stores and to have people come up and just say that when 20 years ago they wouldn't have, because they wouldn't have known the brand. I think that's as good as it gets, just to know that our product is bringing enjoyment to people's lives. And of course, we hope that's responsibly enjoyed. But when you're making people happy, that's a pretty cool thing.
Billy Graham once said, "Each life is made of mistakes and learning, waiting and growing, practicing patience and being persistent." One of the things that has drawn me to studying whiskey and the whiskey industry over the past few years, and what ultimately inspired putting together Whiskey Week, is the time, effort, and patience it takes to produce a great bottle of bourbon or whiskey. It might be obvious, but I can't help but compare it to the process of creating great art or of growing a career or a business. That painstaking process of assembling the right blend of ingredients that go into the barrel, refining them, distilling them, then once it's finished, you wait. Springs turn to summers, summers to falls, falls to winter, and you patiently wait, hoping the ingredients were right. They survive the heat and the cold to form a perfect blend. And after this long cycle of refining, distilling, waiting, when the time is just right, you get a beautiful, uniquely crafted barrel of bourbon. And when that bourbon is ready, It, like art or a hard-earned accomplishment, is meant to be shared and enjoyed. To sip slow, laugh with friends and loved ones, taste the richness and complexity, drink in the fruits of a long, difficult process. And how good it feels then to rise the next day, to search for new grains, to find a new path, begin again. Thank you for listening to Whiskey Week on the Beautiful Work Podcast. Please subscribe or follow us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And sign up for our newsletter at dankrikorian.com or beautifulworkpodcast.com. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.